Good afternoon. I'm John Orlock, the Interim Director of the Baker Nord Center, and it's my pleasure to welcome you this afternoon on this beautiful autumnal day. I mean, autumn this year in Cleveland. For those of you who are in town for the first time, it's especially lovely. The leaves are lingering, the students are lingering, and it's just a glorious time of year. This year's Baker Nord's theme is interpreting capitalism, in which we are investigating capitalism, exploring the topic from any one of a number of perspectives, economically, of course, but also politically, the arts, how it influences our culture. Coming up in the next several weeks, we have programming that will capture that from several angles. Most prominently, Jonathan Sperber is speaking next Thursday, the 14th. Sperber is the author of a new biography of Karl Marx, and a lively presentation. I first saw him on The Daily Show, of all places, and quite a presenter. And so he's here on the 14th. The following week, the 21st, we have Ellen Schrecker, who is speaking on hired education, which will deal with the ways in which the corporate mentality impacts the campus, both in a positive and negative way, perhaps, but that's in 2 weeks. With you is the blue sheet. The blue sheet tells us who you are, why you're here, and how we can contact you to tell you more about what we're doing. And if you may, on your way out, if you'll just fill this out and leave it in the box at the back. Which brings us to today's presentation, which is the Richard N. Campen Lecture in Architecture and Sculpture. And with us today, we have members of the Campen family, including Richard Campen, son of Richard N. Campen and his wife, Margareta, Peter Campen, grandson of Richard N. Campen and his wife, Reagan. Also in the audience are members of the Case School of Architecture, alumni that is, who are here by special invitation. And a past Campen lecturer, Robert Madison, also a CWRU School of Architecture grad, is in the audience as well. Alice T. Friedman comes to us this afternoon from Wellesley College, where she's the Grace Slack McNeil Professor of American Art. Her lecture and seminar courses focus on modern architecture and design, engaging students in an interdisciplinary analysis that emphasizes the significance of culture, conventions, and values in the making of buildings, interiors, and urban spaces. Through her work as founding director of the architecture program, Wellesley has built a distinctive and internationally recognized approach to architectural education, one in which each student creates her own program of study, choosing from courses in studio art, the history of architecture, digital media, and architectural design through cross-registration with MIT. She directs the McNeil Program for Studies in American Art, which focuses on 3 areas of study, including the art and architecture of New England, modern architecture and design in the United States, and the art and architecture of the Americas. She's the author of numerous books and articles, most recently Women in the Making of the Modern House, A Social Architectural History, Yale University Press, 2007, House and Household in Elizabethan England, University of Chicago Press, 1989. And most recently, American Glamour and the Evolution of Modern Architecture, also from Yale University Press. And the Journal of Society of Architectural Historians comments, one of the most intriguing and compelling studies to date on modern architecture. Please join me in welcoming Professor Alice T. Friedman.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for coming out, and thank you for that kind introduction, and for inviting me to lecture this evening at the Baker Nord Center. I'm so grateful for the warm welcome that I've received here, and also, I should say, for the opportunity to meet with architecture students this afternoon and to hear more about what they're learning. I know it's a cliche, but my experience here suggests that it's true that people in the Midwest are actually nicer than people everywhere else. So I'm going to just put this down, if that's okay. To begin my paper. In my recent book, American Glamour and the Evolution of Modern Architecture, published by Yale in 2010, so quite recently, I set out to identify some of the design features and cultural values that are evident in a cluster of modern American buildings of the 1950s, works of architecture that appear at first glance to be fundamentally different from one another, both in function and in overall style. Built for a variety of purposes during a period of intensive economic growth and capital investment, these buildings were much beloved by consumers and by the public at large. Yet they were widely dismissed, as I'm sure you know, by architecture critics as lowbrow, exhibitionist, and unworthy. In short, out of step with the aesthetic and critical values of modern architecture, as these had been codified by European expatriates such as Walter Gropius, Mies van der Rohe, and their former Bauhaus and avant-garde colleagues in the United States. Introduced to the public through mass circulation media, such as Life magazine, and made familiar through glossy photographic images and television appearances, these mid-century modern buildings were seen by many observers as the products of a new economic and cultural order, for better or for worse, depending on which camp you belong to. And as such, they represent an important turning point in American 20th century architecture. My challenge as an architectural historian has been to interpret these buildings within their cultural and economic contexts, and to better understand why and how their critical reception could be, and indeed remains, so polarized. Like all architecture, modern American buildings of the mid-20th century, buildings like Eero Saarinen's TWA building at Kennedy Airport, or Morris Lapidus's Algiers Hotel in Miami Beach, Richard Neutra's Kaufman Desert House on the bottom left, or Frank Lloyd Wright's Temple Beth Shalom in Elkins Park, Pennsylvania, were created by architects who sought to discover new formal, practical, and experiential solutions that would not only respond to the demands of their clients, but also to contribute to shaping a distinctive form of modern architecture for their own time. What distinguishes mid-century modern architecture from the architectures of other times and places, I would argue, and what I hope to show you this evening, is its deeply rooted populism and its commitment to narrative, both through image making and in the myriad spatial experiences it offers. With bold signage, as you can see, bright lights, theatrically expressive forms, and tactile and spatial engagement with the viewer, this architecture seeks to tell the story of the average American man, and not unimportantly, the average American woman as well, as a heroic journey toward progress and prosperity. This commitment to the retelling and reenactment of narratives of optimism and success, familiar to viewers from movies and popular fiction, lies at the core of the modern architecture I've called American glamour. This narrative arc is also fundamental to the narratives of capitalism, with their emphasis on individual prowess and power, their hyper-validation of prescience, risk, and danger, and their celebration of material success through exhibitionism, unencumbered by guilt or moral compass. Thus, the architecture of mid-century American glamour is highly valued by and in tune with our own time of individualism, conspicuous consumption, and wealth disparity. American glamour is an architecture both monumental and incidental, an architecture of Main Street and the commercial strip. On the screen, we can see some outstanding examples. The Casa de Cadillac car dealership on Ventura Boulevard in Los Angeles, 1948. The LAX theme building, which some of you know, of 1961, and the Palms Motor Hotel in Portland, Oregon, all dating from the period between 1946 and 1963. An architecture not just for places like New York and Chicago, but of smaller cities and towns like Detroit and Denver and Los Angeles, places surrounded by the vast prairies and rugged frontiers that stirred the American imagination with thoughts of travel and opportunity, space exploration, of untapped markets and new money. Ultimately then, this is an architecture for and of the ordinary man, quote unquote, who changed the face of America, the man of the, quote, great gizmo, as Rayner Banham put it in an essay of 1965, who he described as having, quote, a gizmo, a gadget, a gimmick in his hand, in his back pocket, across the saddle, on his hip, in the trailer, round his neck, on his head, and deep in a hardened silo. What you might well ask, has this archetypal American frontiersman with his pocket full of gadgets to do with mid-century modern architecture? The answer, I would argue, lies in the particularities of the period, of what the art historian Michael Baxendale called the period eye, which he developed as an analytical tool in visual studies that posits that both art making and the ability to read and appreciate images are shaped by visual experiences, habits of mind, and cultural values that are broadly characteristic of a particular place and time. This includes not only mental associations, such as I've described earlier, with progress and prosperity and individual narratives of heroism and discovery, and not only mental associations with specific colors or forms, such as the ability, let's say, to recognize an image of the Virgin Mary by her blue cloak and halo, but also the skill, the visual skill of sizing up a product and the habit of seeking out a particular cluster of design forms, forms made desirable because of their familiarity or the psychological associations they set in motion. To Baxendale's rather too broad and Eurocentric notion of the period spectator, this person with the period eye, we can now add the particularities of regional identity, gender, sexuality, and class that shape and refine ways of seeing, categories that were not articulated in 1972 when Baxendale first proposed these ideas in a book entitled Painting and Experience in 15th Century Italy. Moreover, I would suggest that it is more useful when talking about architecture to speak about the body as a whole rather than just the eye, and to introduce elements of phenomenology, emotional experience, memory, and desire into the conversation. And I think this is particularly important when we're talking about consumer culture and marketing and capitalism. Clearly, it is through a combination of looking, thinking, imagining, remembering, desiring, and feeling, and ultimately one can say shopping, that architectural expectations and experience are shaped. It seems to me that the key values that shaped both the period eye and the period body in America in the 1950s, particularly for women, stemmed from notions of glamour, an elastic but durable concept that had become popular at the time. The desire for glamour and the ability to recognize it, paired with the high priority placed on individual narratives of progress and material success, had far-reaching implications for mid-century architecture, not only because these were significant values in post-war America, but also, I would argue, because these were the values that lay at the very core of the modern experience. The term glamour, with its roots in the Scottish word for magic and occult learning, had been used at least since the mid-19th century, although it was not until the advent of industrial urban society in the 1920s and 30s that it became widespread. Dictionary definitions, and you'll have to bear with me for just a moment while I talk about this, I think it will be helpful. The way that the dictionaries of the period define it vary fairly widely and almost always require multiple headings to encompass its various meanings. But all of them emphasize the artificial construction of an image through adornments, like clothing, cosmetics, or jewelry, and through theatrical staging and lighting, or distinctive physical movements. Moreover, definitions of glamour usually include some reference to the magical or dreamlike effects these devices had on observers. For example, as we see here, through the visual and mental association of a woman in an evening gown, a new model Oldsmobile, and a fast-moving jet streaking across the night sky. So creating a constellation of images that all enhance each other and then come to reflect each other. One of the clearest definitions of glamour comes from the Funk and Wagnall's New Standard Dictionary, first published in 1924. First, some charm or enchantment operating on the vision and causing them to seem different from what they really are, as, for example, a haze or other softening atmospheric effects, a magical spell or witchcraft. And two, any artificial interest or association by which an object is made to appear to the mental vision delusively magnified, exalted, or glorified. Also, the effect of such cause, illusion, fascination, witchery. Most post-war definitions also emphasize the association of glamour with specific actions and occupations, such as one finds in the worlds of film and fashion. And they focus on the emotional responses, notably envy and desire, of observers. So glamour is also interactive. And this no doubt reflects the influence of Hollywood and celebrity culture in general. For example, in the Random House Dictionary of 1966, the definition is as follows. One, excitement, adventure, and unusual activity such as to arouse envy, as in the glamour of being an explorer. Two, the quality of fascinating, alluring, or attracting, especially by a combination of charm and good looks. And three, magic or enchantment, spell, witchery. Webster's third dictionary of 1961 adds a more specific secondary meaning that brings us closer to the sense in which most people use the term currently. Personal charm and poise combined with unusual physical and sexual attractiveness. This last meaning is surely the way in which readers of Glamour magazine, which began publication as Glamour of Hollywood in 1939 and changed its name 2 years later, and many other publications of the time used the word in the mid-20th century. But the matter remained complex then as now. The first issue of the magazine goes to some lengths to provide a definition, using a series of celebrity interviews, articles, advertisements, and glossy glamour photos of movie stars to circle around these multiple meanings. Here as elsewhere, the prevailing definitions referred to image making, dominated by associations with Hollywood and the magical ability of objects, and we should emphasize here, of buildings and interiors, to enhance an individual's power, sexual attractiveness, or allure. Most significant of all for Glamour magazine's purposes and for our own as we attempt to come to terms with this concept as a cultural value that shapes a period eye, was the promise that even ordinary individuals could acquire some of this power for themselves through consumption, guided by the images and products contained in films and magazines, and through the construction of elaborate dream worlds filled with desirable objects and experiences. Glamour made this democratic and egalitarian message very clear. And I'll just read you this definition as quickly as possible. And this comes from Glamour magazine. Entertainment is Hollywood's business, but its byproduct and most powerful magnet is glamour. Glamour, that strange chameleon of a word with a different meaning for each user. What is it? Enchantment, illusion, witchery? Yes, but more than all three of these. Glamour is a quality each of us sees in some other human and wishes she possessed. And they continue in Glamour magazine. And Hollywood, more than any other place, knows the art of remaking men and women into a closer likeness of our wishful thinking. Of course it's illusion. Movie stars are mere flesh and blood, little different from all of us. Our minds know this, even as our eyes see beauty, and it makes the enchantment of Hollywood all the more tantalizing. Looking at a photograph of Richard Neutra's Kaufman Desert House in Palm Springs of 1946, it isn't hard to recognize the elements of illusion, enchantment, and glamour that make the image of the house, and of course photography is essential here, make the image of the house, which was built for the same successful department store magnate who had built Frank Lloyd Wright's Falling Water in the previous decade, that make the image of the house so powerful. Choice of site, effects of lighting, the addition of elements like the elegantly spare swimming pool and the glass curtain wall, all contribute to the magical effect. Clearly, these distinctive qualities are the result of collaborative efforts of staging, image making, and choreography for both interior and exterior spaces. How would Richard Neutra's Kaufman Desert House look to our eyes, and perhaps more important, appear in our memories and imaginations without the intervention of the lighting designer Richard Kelly and the photographer Julius Shulman? How do the contributions of these artists, together with the work of interior designers, muralists, furniture designers, sculptors, and other contributors, enhance the work of architecture and make it memorable as both product and experience? As depicted in Shulman's famous photograph, the Kaufman House appears as an abstract composition of planes, volumes, and lines, all brought to life by a vivid lighting scheme in which the soffit planes, those slashes of light underneath the roof line, interior volumes, and the deep pool of water, to name only the most obvious elements, all shine brightly against the dark background of lawn, trees, and backlighted mountains. As some of you already know, Shulman's photograph was not only the result of careful staging, and we should note here the figure of Liliane Kaufman reclining by the pool in a position chosen specifically by Shulman to block the glare of the underwater pool light, but also a product of extensive work in the lab and of Shulman's decision to turn on every light in the house at once for his photo so that the theatrical and spectacular character of the house in its context could be brought to life most successfully. As Life magazine, from which this spread comes, put it in 1949, Shulman's photograph glamorized Neutra's modern architecture. Yet it's equally clear that just as much, or even more of the credit, is owed to the lighting scheme, which was the work of the great Richard Kelly, without whom not only Neutra, but many other modern architects, including Saarinen, Kahn, and Johnson, would have been left in the dark, both literally and figuratively. So when we turn to a contemporary example, like Philip Johnson's Glass House in New Canaan of 1949, we find ample evidence of the impact of Kelly's artistry. Here, the exterior lighting scheme served to transform the house as twilight settled into night from an isolated and ultimately vulnerable domain set in a dark and unmeasurable landscape, into a lantern of light filled, a lantern of light surrounded by lighted trees and shrubs. Kelly's design thus not only affected the control of the landscape for Johnson as the occupant of the house, but also created privacy on the interior of the glass house in a way that quite famously was lacking for the female occupant of Mies van der Rohe's contemporary Farnsworth House in Plano, Illinois. Moreover, thanks in large part to the lighting design, the glass house itself, like the Kaufman Desert House, was transformed into a place of glamorous theatrical spectacle, a perfect spot for entertaining and for enjoying the landscape seductively and flatteringly illuminated with as much care as any Broadway celebrity or star of the silver screen. These effects of focused light and shadow, illustrating Kelly's fundamental principles about the close relationship between emotional experience and a well-planned lighting scheme, are visible throughout the New Canaan complex, notably in Johnson's brick guest house, which you see on the left, where, incidentally, we see Andy Warhol lying in bed and looking out the window on the right-hand image with Philip Johnson seated behind him. As in the previous example, the natural effects of daylight and shadow, and the reflections off the glass walls in particular, become part of an overall experience of a distinctive and magical place. Some of you may already know the words with which Phyllis Lambert, Johnson's great friend and collaborator later at the Seagram Building, described the effect of light in the guest house, but they're worth quoting here. And there's a better view of the interior. Lambert spoke of the palpable presence of place at the glass and brick houses, describing in particular what she called the highly sensual effects of the design. And she wrote this: an ecstatic aura pervaded the guest room. One was not aware of entering a tall, narrow, windowless, tomb-like space, but rather was captivated by the glow of light, washing the sand-like experience of pink, silver, and gold Fortuny cloth covering the enclosing walls. And this silk cloth on the walls really does have a slight pink tinge that you can't really see in the image. Turning the knob of a substantial dimmer box at the head of the bed, she writes, an early use of this new technology, one had the sense of nightfall in the desert, under the vaulted canopy, a sheltering firmament as the light gradually faded. This evocative recollection would no doubt have pleased Richard Kelly, who had written about light in similarly poetic terms, turning the physical into an emotional experience, as well as a visual and physical experience. He compared his principal notion of what he called ambient luminescence, for example, to, quote, a snowy morning in open country, twilight haze on a mountaintop, or a cloudy day on the ocean, the light in a white tent at noon, moonlight coming through the fog, unquote. Speaking of another of his lighting principles, in this case something he called focal glow, Kelly described it as, quote, the sunburst through the clouds and the shaft of sunshine that warms the far end of the valley. It is the pool of light in at your favorite reading chair, your airplane seat light or match light on the face. Focal glow is the end of the rainbow. It commands attention, creates interest, fixes the gaze, and tells people what to look at. Deployed here to enhance the experience of a domestic context, it's not hard to recognize a narrative like Kelly's as containing the core concepts of marketing and commercial lighting design, two areas in which he was equally adept. At the Glass House in New Canaan, a sort of architectural laboratory for Philip Johnson, these effects knit together interior and exterior space, turning the entire architectural mise-en-scène of house and landscape into a glamorous stage set on which the drama of perception, reaction, and emotion, as much or more than the evident social drama of human ritual, could be experienced. Here, architecture itself is the star, and the house becomes an object illuminated by Kelly in a way that makes both spaces and their occupants look better. The result is both an image and a feeling, a desire and a memory that are key components of both the architecture of American glamour and the popular culture of capitalist consumption. So if we turn then to another project, a corporate project, we can continue our analysis of these features of this mid-century modern architecture. At the General Motors Technical Center, completed in 1956, just outside of Detroit, to the designs of Eero Saarinen and his father Eliel, and dubbed by Life magazine a Versailles of industry. We see the same techniques deployed in a corporate context, representing an enormous and unprecedented investment in a campus devoted to product development. The effects of Kelly's lighting plan are visible in the brightness of highly saturated colored brick walls, as well as in the manipulation of light and reflective materials throughout the compound, both day and night. In the interior, stage-like settings, such as the double staircase in the main lobby of the styling section, celebrated the product, its designers, and its highly marketed image through elegant materials, a brilliant lighting plan, and thrilling spatial theatrics. As a research facility and a think tank, the GM Center clearly inspired its workers and designers. Moreover, a well-planned photographic image, such as the one on the left, this time by the great photographer Ezra Stoller, transformed the space into a magical and highly resonant showroom, perfect for glossy advertisements and fashion shoots, capturing the effects of ceiling illumination, the wash of light over the surface of the wall of dark glazed brick to the left, and the spotlighting along the surface of the pool beneath the stairs. I'm particularly interested in the use of reflective materials for space making here as well, such as the screen of stretched stainless steel wire that forms an enclosure around the staircase. So this device of creating space out of stainless steel wire, and you can see it on the left and on the right, is also used in the research section lobby, where the spiral staircase with its black marble treads becomes like a stage set, lit from an oculus above and enlivened through the use of reflective materials. Wire again, chrome on the car, the brilliance of its red color, or the shine of the model's hair. So all of these things go together in the architecture that creates a mood and focuses our eye, as Richard Kelly said, the lighting tells us what to look at. I believe this example clinches the argument for making Kelly's work at GM a focal element in the study of American glamour. Here's Kelly on the subject of what he called a play of brilliance, such as these pinpoints of light. A play of brilliance, he wrote, the sensation of a cache of diamonds in an open cave, or the Versailles Hall of Mirrors with its thousands of candle flames, a ballroom of crystal chandeliers. The play of brilliance is Times Square at night, sunlight on a tumbling brook, the heaven full of stars, birch trees interlaced by a motor car's headlights. All these incredibly evocative images. The play of brilliance excites the optic nerves, stimulates the body and the spirit, and charms the senses. It creates a feeling of aliveness, alerts the mind, awakens curiosity, and sharpens the wits. It quickens the appetite and heightens all sensations. It is a tiny microscopic bombardment of points of light, the most exciting kind of light there is. It stimulates and arouses appetites of all kinds. This is a man who loved his work, clearly. This stimulation and arousal of appetites of all kinds, as Kelly put it, was a conscious priority in the design of much of mid-century American architecture, not simply for buildings intended for domestic, commercial, or entertainment purposes, but for a wide range of other building types as well. Clearly, Kelly's work and that of his cohort and followers in lighting design was central to the creation of this experience. Moreover, by focusing on the phenomenological effects of immersive environments rather than on buildings as functional objects, mid-century designers shifted the emphasis away from the formal devices and rational control of the earlier 20th century European modernists, focusing instead on a heightened awareness of central effects, the orchestration of emotions and desires that one finds at mid-century, particularly in the United States. To many architectural critics, however, such devices represented an unacceptable incursion into the world of modern architecture with its claims not only to purity of form, but also to social reform by the marketing men and their methods. Saarinen received a great deal of negative criticism for this within the architectural profession, even as his reputation and that of his buildings soared in the popular press. This transition within modern architecture's evolution was also particularly dramatic in the career of Philip Johnson, who we met earlier at his glass house a few moments ago, one of modernism's most dedicated critics and narrators, as well as a prominent New York architect with considerable cachet and power. Here again, it is to Richard Kelly, his frequent collaborator, that a great deal of the credit should go. At the Four Seasons Bar and Restaurant in the Seagram Building, a project of 1958, to which I will return in a moment, we see them at work together again, orchestrating the effects of glamour in one of the principal power centers of the city. In the restaurant's pool room, for example, on the top and bottom, we can recognize the signature Kelly lighting devices in the basin of water at the center of the composition, as well as the use of diffused daylight from the exterior windows, uplights on the four-corner trees, modulated washes on the walls, which you see there, and spots on the ceilings. As at General Motors, the use of variegated and reflective materials enhances these effects of light and shadow. Notable in this context are the tricolor beaded metal curtains designed by Kelly and artist Marie Nichols, which hang in loose swags and undulate softly thanks to the rush of air rising from the vents below. Together with Kelly's ambient luminescence and focal glow, the shifting pinpricks of light animated by this, albeit unforeseen, effect of the curtains contributes to both the elegance of the room and the dreamlike quality of its lighting. Johnson, following Mies, gave the space a double-edged character, at once classicizing and formal in its geometry and order, but also delicate and seductive in a way that created the perfect stage set on which the high-powered dramas and high-stake trysts of the Park Avenue clientele could be played out. Also of note are the ways in which mid-century architects like Neutra, Saarinen, Johnson, and others filled their buildings with works of art and other elements that enhance the effect and animate both interior and exterior space. Here we can point in particular to the work of Alexander Calder at GM, where he designed a brightly illuminated fountain in the huge reflecting pool. We're seeing it from two different angles here, with water jets that could be choreographed electronically for day and night. Together with the Saarinen designed stainless steel water tower, which you see on the top, this feature helped to define the landscape of the campus at the GM Technical Center, as did a far smaller element like Antoine Pevsner's Bird in Flight, a work of constructivist sculpture notable for its reflective surfaces, its twisting open form, and its radiating lines, which recall the use of steel wire in the styling section staircase. So on the one hand, these forms brought by an architect, on the other hand, the effort to bring avant-garde art to create an additional layer of mood and glamour in these contexts. At General Motors, Saarinen also prominently featured the work of a less well-known artist, notably Harry Bertoia, a friend from Cranbrook, who designed the highly reflective bronze screen in the cafeteria building, bringing this beautiful work of art into the dining area for the workers the designers who were working at GM, shown here in both day and night views, a work that is clearly advantaged by Kelly's lighting scheme. As at the MIT Chapel and Kresge Auditorium Complex, which you see here, Kresge at the top, the chapel on the bottom, in Cambridge, Massachusetts, a project also enriched by the collaboration of Saarinen, Kelly, and Bertoia in these same years. The contrast between a lantern of bright light shining from behind transparent walls and the dense surfaces of brick on the bottom are materials that enclose a companion space or a signature element. So too are the use of highly reflected surfaces, a basin of water in the moat that encircles the base of the chapel, the metal filaments and thin bronze tiles suspended behind the altar in Bertoia's screen, a bright oculus above, the white travertine marble floor, looking sort of golden in color in this image, and the glazed brick of the entrance lobby that make this interior feel so baroque and theatrical. Here the lighting design is the work of Stanley McCandless, Richard Kelly's teacher and mentor at Yale, whose experience as a theater specialist clearly comes into play, enhancing the drama of the space and the rituals enacted there. Returning again for one last look at General Motors, we note here that the work of artists like Bertoia clearly contributed to the creation of an animate environment in which light, color, modern architecture, and background art play a signal role in producing a glamorous image. Such artistic details as the juxtaposition of Saarinen's teacup reception desk, which you see in both images, again, evoking this idea of space travel, I would say, with the decorative aluminum screen behind it, which was the work of a woman or artist called Buell Mullen, gives the styling section lobby its distinctive period character, and one might add its particular corporate glamour. In this context, we should take a moment to recall the well-known saga of the Rothko painting cycle intended for the upper dining room of Johnson's Four Seasons restaurant. So to the right behind the tree was a large room, which was originally intended to have a painting cycle by Mark Rothko. Some of you know this story from the play Red by John Logan, which was first performed in 2009. Rothko's paintings were commissioned by Johnson and Lambert for the Seagram project, and Rothko not only agreed to do the work, but painted the entire beautiful cycle in his studio, only to withdraw his project in protest, refusing to allow his paintings to serve as backdrop decorations, he said, in such a crude, pretentious, bourgeois context as a restaurant for corporate fat cats. He actually said he hoped, you'll excuse me, that the son of a bitch would lose their appetite from looking at his paintings. Obviously, the conflicting aims of avant-garde artists, architects, clients, critics, and consumers sometimes flared up as the goals and limits of these collaborations and the economics of these commissions were tested in real-life situations. At General Motors, artists like Calder, Pevsner, Bertoia, Mullen, and others, called upon by Eero Saarinen and his client Harley Earl, who was the head designer at GM, to enrich the building and its landscape, seemed more realistic, perhaps, or more pragmatic than Rothko about the opportunities and limitations that such work for corporate clients entailed. Such was clearly the case with Harry Bertoia's work for Manufacturers Hanover Trust, 5th Avenue and 43rd Street in New York, a project of 1954, here shown to us in another beautiful Ezra Stoller photograph. Here the artist inserted two works into the glass box. You can just see it on the second floor, and here's a better view with the golden screen in the bank. The glass box created for the bank by Skidmore, Owings and Merrill's lead designers, Gordon Bunshaft and the great Natalie Dubois, who recently died, an unsung woman hero of modern architecture. Shown here, we can observe a modernist approach typical of American glamour: the brightly lighted ceiling panels, broad expanses of glass, monumental form, and clearly framed view from the street that showcase the interior and its furnishings. There was even a highly polished stainless steel vault just inside the first floor, and clearly visible from the street, as if you could go window shopping for money. The foregrounding of this piece of modernist equipment, this beautifully polished work of technology, was brilliant capitalist showmanship, suggesting modernism's glamorous embrace of new technology, at the same time filling the public audience with envy, desire, and, by a not so subtle process of association, an embodied love of money. The recently landmarked building preserves Bertoia's glorious monumental screen in the unlikely landscape of a new flagship store for the clothing retailer Joe Fresh. Maybe this is just a cruder version of the original setting, with its unashamed, though entirely upscale dedication to capitalism and its workings. Theatricalizing the activities of the always busy cash desks at Joe Fresh, Bertoia's screen serves as a kind of altarpiece, highlighting the consumer and ennobling the transactions that go on in front of it. Other sculptors also contributed to the effect of notable mid-century modern interiors, and I just want to show you one other example. Working primarily in wire on spatial constructions, Richard Lippold, who we see here, teamed with Johnson and Richard Kelly on a number of sites, including the Four Seasons. Born in Milwaukee and educated in industrial art and design at the Art Institute of Chicago, he came to the attention of Gropius and Albers and began teaching at Black Mountain College in 1948. Though primarily based in New York, Lippold's work was shaped by this experience and by his lifelong association with artists such as John Cage, Ray Johnson, and Buckminster Fuller, who he met at Black Mountain. His national reputation was sealed by the patronage not only of Philip Johnson, but of commissions received from prominent figures like Walter Gropius, who's actually at the bottom, hanging from the bottom of the World Tree by Lippold. Gropius had asked Lippold to create this so-called World Tree of stainless steel rods at Harkness Commons at Harvard in 1950. At the Four Seasons, Lippold was responsible for the beautiful bronze clouds created by hanging hundreds of bronze rods vertically from strands of invisible filament that were placed over the bar, which you see there, and you can see those swags of those Marie Nichols curtains, beaded curtains behind, and of course Kelly's lighting scheme, which now you can recognize these washes down the walls and the pinpoints of light, all of which came together to create a glamorous environment. Lippold's space-defining but dematerial sculptures, enhanced by Kelly's lighting design and complemented by Marie Nichols and Richard Kelly's beaded curtains, create the glitter of brilliance and a warm glow throughout the room, light effects that give the space its distinctive elegance and seductiveness. Moreover, Lippold's sculpture seems to change continually over the course of an evening, becoming more occluded with the lateness of the hour and the swirling effects of the social scene, an experience of shimmering forms, soft focus, against which the stage-like organization of formal elements enlarges the presence of human actors. At the height of his career, Lippold collaborated with a number of other architects, including Skidmore, Owings and Merrill, on corporate commissions. resulting in some of his most successful, but I think to our eyes, very unusual projects. These include an installation called Radiant 1 in the lobby of the Inland Steel Building in Chicago of 1957, where a wire construction lighted from above is suspended over a pool of water, and the extraordinary installation in the Pan Am Building, now the MetLife Building in New York, by Gropius and Wroblewski, entitled Flight, completed in 1964. This project was originally intended to include motion-activated, randomized sound pieces by John Cage. Speaking of bringing the avant-garde into a corporate context with sometimes unforeseen results. The unforeseen result in this case was that the client refused the John Cage piece of this project, right? Too avant-garde. Cage was a longtime friend and associate of Lippold, and these sound pieces would have emanated from speakers concealed around the room and would be activated by the motion of people going through the lobby of the Pan Am Building. Though characterized by some critics as a purveyor of a sort of soft modernism intended to introduce modern yet non-threatening effects for exactly this sort of corporate context, and pilloried, Lippold was pilloried by Hilton Kramer as, quote, our foremost public decorator in an article in the New York Times. Lippold firmly believed that his lobby installation would successfully introduce an avant-garde element into a corporate project, and that Cage's music would offer an alternative to the calming muzak that had been planned for the lobby and indeed for the entire building. Oddly enough, the artist was reportedly quite surprised, somewhat in the manner of Mark Rothko perhaps, to discover the limitations of his client's commitment to artistic risk-taking when the Cage part of his project was abruptly canceled, though Lippold did win a sort of partial victory when there was an agreement to keep the muzak recordings out of this lobby. Finally, we encounter the most prominent figures of our story working together again at Lincoln Center, where Kelly was responsible for the lighting throughout the complex, and a team of architects, including Philip Johnson, Wallace K. Harrison, Max Abramowitz, Eero Saarinen, and Pietro Wroblewski, divided up responsibility for the buildings across this campus, right? So in this case, we see a campus like the campus at GM, creating these new environments of the post-war period, usually separated from the rest of the environment. In the case of GM out in the countryside in Moron, Michigan, here raised up on a podium, as some of you know, and taken out of the realm of the city in a way that we now don't support as urban planning. But this group collaborated on these buildings, and one might say that by the mid and late 60s, the peak moment of post-war glamour and optimism had begun to fade behind an overblown monumentality and historicism. One can clearly recognize this decline, in my view, in Lippold's overscaled Orpheus and Apollo, which you see hanging at the top of the slide on the right in Avery Fisher Hall's lobby. Nevertheless, here again, we must take note of the exquisite character of Kelly's lighting design, a scheme which creates a mood of festive celebration in what might easily appear a rather barn-like, monochrome, late modern space. Ultimately, what such an example demonstrates is that in the work of architectural history, much remains to be done. We cannot remain satisfied with the version of events that places responsibility for this signal work, or group of works, of American modernism on the shoulders of the associated architects, shown here in the famous photograph on the screen. Johnson, Saarinen, Wallace K. Harrison, you can recognize some of them, I'm sure. Nor can we divorce this project and its interiors from the goals, financial and otherwise, of the politicians, investors, urban planners, and others who collaborated in creating it. On the contrary, we're now in a position to complicate and analyze the picture, inserting architects, artists, lighting designers, and a host of others into our story, a story in which a handful of key American buildings were brought to life by light and art, and thus transformed into a cluster of glamorous stage sets on which the large and small dramas of modern life in post-war America could be played out. As investments in culture or entertainment, product development or sales, they represented brilliant investments in visual and environmental marketing. Indeed, the fact that these buildings, recently renovated by Diller and Scofidio, continue to claim such a prominent place in the image and experience of present-day New Yorkers remains a testament to their power, not only to dazzle with their lights, their colors, and their ever-changing spectacle, but also with their evocative spatial experiences, filling the men and women who visit them with desire and the vague sense of having been in these places before, complete with the feeling that they can recall memories and emotions that they may never have experienced firsthand, but for which advertising and fashion and movies and television had prepared them so well. Thank you very much.
And now we'll move on to some Q&A. And there is a mic set at either end. And please come forward.
I'm happy to answer any questions that, whoops, not with that though. I'm happy to answer any questions that people might have or comments on this approach to these buildings, criticisms of the architecture itself. Yes?
It's always a pleasure to see Dr. Gropius show up in presentations on modernism. However, Gropius was an idealist, I think, and was run out of Germany precisely because of his sort of leftist socialist leanings. It's curious that his architecture then becomes so closely associated in this argument with American architecture for capitalism.
Right.
Can you explain the disjunct?
Well, that's precisely the problem that many critics had, right? And we see it in these kinds of conflicts between architects and artists and theorists and critics. The critics who were really hard on Saarinen and Johnson, for example, and Harrison for compromising the values of international style modernism. But the US in the post-war decades was a very different place than Europe in the post-World War I decades. And there was a lot of hand-wringing even amongst the Bauhaus architects, Gropius, Breuer, and others, about how to shift the goals of modern architecture to survive in the context of the US where there was money and jobs. But it was never really successfully, the question was never really successfully resolved. So that there emerged this split, I think, between Gropius, who at TAC remained an idealist all through his career, well, into the 60s, and architects like Saarinen, who believed that you could invent a new form for each job, right? And that each job could have its own family of forms, internal to itself, but no consistent ideological or formal language in exactly the way you described, really compromising fundamentally the goals of the earlier European modernism. Sure.
Philip Johnson was notoriously a fascist, yet no values to compromise.
Well, right, exactly. And that's, I think if you look at the work across his career, he is an architect second, I think, and a theorist first. He's interested in exploring the closed and the open, private, not private. He had no problem putting a glamorous restaurant and bar into Mises' great Seagram building. And, despite the fact that he was a rotten person and apologized profusely for his fascist activities in the 30s and 40s, those compromises and those activities stayed with him his entire career.
Use the term unmentality. This is an architecture which is very fundamental of this reaction. Yes, I think this is very ephemeral architecture. It reminds me of, well, getting this, but a lot of lighting effects and social effects.
Yeah, I agree. Exactly. In the Seagram, in the Four Seasons, yeah, I think that's good. And here too, rather insubstantial. Sorry, I can't move this again.
What comes is brutalist. It seems to me that there is a new one that's coming in, which is in some sense opposed to the.
Well, I think that's absolutely right. That what's characteristic of this period, in my view, 48 to 63, is this kind of, it's Main Street and it's monumental. It's ephemeral, and it tries to make big statements at the same time. And so what we're left with as historians is a lack of categories. That it's very, very hard to put it into categories and understand it. So it seems to me that while it's on the one hand monumental, on the other hand ephemeral in its effects, and that ultimately it ends up with, Lincoln Center. Ultimately it ends up with monumentality and then finally brutalism. That to understand those buildings, this hodgepodge of funny, odd things, that the theme that seems to go through it and connect them all in some kind of way is this odd notion of glamour, this odd idea about marketing, seeing and being seen, the hyper attention to vision and narrative across these very disparate, stylistically very disparate buildings, and in which to which the term, as the other gentleman noted, whoops, sorry, I seem to have knocked on something. No, maybe that's back. The term modernism can't really readily be applied either by all critics. The orthodox modernist of the Bauhaus or even followers of Corp felt, that this was just, as I said in the beginning, lowbrow, and that all these lighting effects weren't architecture, they were theater, and that had nothing to do with architecture. And what I'm trying to argue is that all these media come together to produce effects. The architecture is disparate, but the effects have some kind of consistency. And then it all goes away, right? That in the beginnings of postmodernism and brutalism, something very different happens by the mid-60s everywhere, right? That optimism of the 50s and the late 40s goes away and is replaced by, all of the social justice movements, and rightly so. And the new modern critique, the new anti-modern critiques of the 60s and 70s. There was another question. Sorry, my answer's a bit long. Yes. Yeah, Lisa.
I was thinking about your lighting discussion and
I think you need to go to the mic. I'm sorry.
oh, sorry. Your discussion of the lighting design certainly seemed to me very much about consumerism, that everyone's trying to sort of consume these ideas of glamour. And I, being a photo historian, I have seen a lot of Ezra Steller's pictures recently because they're all over the New York galleries, and
right.
all the Four Seasons pictures were up, and some of the General Motors pictures as well. But clearly there's a whole set of pictures that were not made for commercial purposes, which have such an entirely different star character that I was just, I was just interested as to if that's something that you noticed in your work.
Yeah.
Just sort of the eye of the photographer, that Julie Shulman was very much a commercial artist, and and that these guys had private moments that showed very different aspects of
Yeah,
the
I
architecture.
think that's a great point, because so much in these, I mean, the famous images by Stoller and Schulman capture this side,
The glamour.
but the staging of these buildings to glamorous effect was obviously an important part of their mission or identity or the client's goals. But then, you turn out the lights, or as you say, the private aspects.
Well, Stoller did these pictures of the GM showroom with nothing in it but a telephone on the floor in like 1961, and I just thought this was such a great picture that obviously I was wondering whether that was some sort of private comment on his own work in the commercial sector.
Yeah, that's a great idea.
Yeah.
Well, I think the awareness of perhaps of the duality is created by the high production values throughout. The lights are on, the models are there, and a friend who, when I gave a version of this, said, "Well, why are you calling Philip Johnson's glass house glamorous when it's so remote in its location that no one could look at him? No one looked through the window." And I think the answer to that is that it's like the marketing of a product, that you have to think about seeing it at all, you think about being seen even when there's nobody there to see you.
Or how it's reproduced.
Right. Or equally, the private mulling over fashion photos, imagining yourself in the movie, imagining yourself in the photo, is a private moment of fantasy. And it doesn't require another spectator. I think the fact that you feel good by buying something, which is ultimately the goal of the capitalist experience, you feel good, and even if you get it home and go, why did I feel good? I don't feel good anymore, is a very large part of the drama that's created around it. And I think that the period eye for this moment suggests that the architecture is attempting to do something else. But it's like the person without makeup, the buildings have their down times.
Thanks.
Thank you. Great talk.
Given that the zeitgeist, the private eye, is conspicuous consumption, glamour, and all that, how did this trickle down and influence this huge building boom of Levittowns and suburbs everywhere?
That's a great question too, because even in the Levittown type of historicist or vernacular revival architecture, I think in the interiors of those houses and the landscaping of those houses, there's a fascination with products and the way in which the new technologies like the washing machines or the embedded televisions, or even the wagon wheel fences or things like that they're largely about either a narrative of progress in the technology or a narrative of Americanness, or quite simply a narrative of being the first generation to own your own house and being there. That it's a story about, I think this moment in particular is a story about immigrants coming to the US, a story about making it in America, whether it's true or not, and that these high-budget, high-end projects are in dialogue with the suburbs very intimately, even if it's just with Life magazine coming through the letterbox. Thank you all very much.